I think we can start now.
Mm-hmm.
So, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. My name is Raza Rumi, and I head a center at Ithaca College called the Center for Independent Media. And the Park Center for Independent Media basically examines the role of independent media and its impact on journalism, society, democracy, etc. And we both try and work within the college campus with students and faculty, as well as we try and engage with the world outside the college campus. And we are extremely delighted and honored to have this collaborative event with Afterimage, a very prestigious journal of media arts. And its editor is with us, and she will talk a bit more about the journal. Basically, it is we have 5 speakers. You've seen their names, and their detailed bios will be in the chat section. And you can refer to them. Some of the links of their works will also be available. Please feel free to browse them as the event proceeds. After a brief presentation by each of our 5 speakers, we shall open up the conversation for Q&A session. Please put in your questions in the Q&A window, and they will be addressed. And we are keeping a good amount of time for the Q&A session so that we make this event more participative and interactive. Also, I would request you to keep your questions focused and introduce yourself, and make sure that the questions are precise and have preferably a person whom you want to ask that question from. So without further ado, I shall begin with our first speaker. Our first speaker is, of course, Karen van Meenen, who's the editor of Afterimage. And over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Raza. My name is Karen van Meenen. I'm the editor of Afterimage. I've been with the journal since 1993, so I'm going to give you a little bit of history and up to the present. Photographer, curator, and educator Nathan Lyons established Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester, New York in 1969 as a nonprofit arts and education center. 3 years later, he felt the need for publication, so in early 1972, he founded and was one of the first editors of Afterimage. Afterimage was intended to be a service to the field of visual arts. Lyons saw a need for a new kind of critical journal, one that was cross-disciplinary, expanding its reach beyond photography studies and into the interstitial territory reflected in the publication's tagline, which we've retained, the Journal of Media Arts and Cultural Criticism. Afterimage was first published in tabloid format, printing in black and white on newsprint and coming out monthly. Through the intervening decades, Afterimage has provided an increasingly international forum for emerging academics, writers, and critics, as well as for curators and makers and students, covering photography, film, video, book arts, media literacy, media ecology, and the intersections of so many other concerns in the visual arts and society. This hybridity has always been the journal's strength. While even expanding the original multidisciplinary nature of the journal, we are now in some ways at the other end of the spectrum. For 45 years, we were able to maintain a print presence, but as of 2019, we are fully online, taking the form of a quarterly journal published by an academic entity, the University of California Press. We have established an international editorial board and are incorporating peer-reviewed content as part of our broad offerings of news, reports, essays, features, and reviews. Afterimage continues to act in service, playing a unique role in a vast and vacillating field. Now taking advantage of what modern technologies can offer, such as interactive forums like this. And dossiers, such as the one that inspired today's event, are an important element of our future. These collections provide a venue for the voices of both academics and makers to tackle the myriad and sometimes sticky aspects of an element of the field or an issue, and do so in a timely manner. This dossier on co-creation and documentary, which again provides just the starting point for this discussion, is a fine example of this rich possibility. Its contributors have broadened the scopes of their essays, published many months ago, to incorporate the challenges and opportunities of pandemic and protest in their remarks in our discussion today. I thank you for being here and being part of this important and continuing conversation. I'll turn it back to Raza.
Thank you very much, Karen. And before we go on to our next speaker, I would like to welcome all our participants, especially those who have joined from many countries across the world, and of course those who have joined us from within the US, just to highlight that we have participants from Mexico, Argentina, the UK, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and I'm sure many others. And welcome and thanks for being here. Our next speaker is, of course, our very dear Professor Patricia Zimmerman from Ithaca College. She's a professor of screen studies and also the co-director of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, or called FLEF as well. Over to you, Dr. Zimmerman.
Thank you, Raza. I'm going to talk about co-creation. Co-creation is a massive paradigm shift in documentary, and an even more massive paradigm shift as we coordinate documentary co-creation with pandemic and protest, which are all of global impact and proportions. I'm part of, with my colleagues here today, a working group exploring co-creation for the last 4 years and the way in which emerging media practices engage co-creation. We've presented at the Visible Evidence Conference. We were invited to the MIT 2018 Co-Creation Symposium. We've been involved in the debates initiated by Alex Yuhas and Alyssa Lebeau on Beyond Story in documentary. So this is part of a continuing international dialogue. I'd like to talk about the 4 vectors today: co-creation, documentary, pandemic, and protest. This is a generative catalyzing massive change and reset in documentary and journalistic practices. It's a quadrant that's in constant movement. What we'll be looking at is collaborative and participatory work that is small-scale media to be mobilized and utilized during pandemic and protest. So as the pandemic and protests are global, we are all in our homes in these more small-scale kinds of matrices, and these are interacting in different kinds of ways. What is co-creation? Co-creation has a very long history. It's not new with digitality. It is horizontal rather than vertical. It moves from the one to the many. Its history is long. It goes back to the Workers Who Win Photo Leagues in the 1930s, the development of Apple Shop in the 70s, Paper Tiger in the 80s, visual communications for Asian American media in the 1970s, the Newsreel Collective, New Orleans Video Access, Scribe Video, and of course Challenge for Change in Canada, and indigenous media on the ground, fourth world media practices in New Zealand, Brazil, Nigeria, Australia, New Mexico, and elsewhere. Co-creation has many terms appended to it, including activist, collective, community, participatory, political, engaged media, fan-generated, citizen journalism, media from below. All of this media practice is micro rather than macro. It inverts hierarchies and responds and intervenes and participates in unresolved political issues. A definition of co-creation is that this is work that's against extraction, against documentary extraction. It dispenses with directors and authors and single authorship and moves towards the horizontality of the collaborative and participatory. These are polyphonic practices of many voices. These are practices that assemble differences, diversity, and positions that are enacted by using process, fluidity, and iterations. This is the exact opposite of a Netflix feel-good documentary or an HBO documentary or a theatrical documentary. These works use long time frames. They deal with immersion, and they are as much about making media as they are about building relationships from the ground up. These are works that enter into and deal with contested spaces and with issues that are dramatically unresolved, as in the case of pandemic and protests. These are practices committed to dialogue and to dialectics. That is, really engaging contradictions and working those. Documentary now is a multiplication of forms across many platforms, and we would call this multiscalar. Films, installation, web, gaming, short form, audio, sound, elaborated and embodied performance, archives, distributive modes, diaries. We've seen a proliferation of this work during the pandemic and protest, and I want to conclude with some concrete examples. For the pandemic, the global COVID-19 tracker, 20 expats from Wuhan and elsewhere in 5 countries tracking information and doing data visualization to fight the racialization of the pandemic. Engage Media in the Philippines, working to deal in the Philippines and Thailand to deal with infodemics. The Collecting Whales Project, which is stories from below of the pandemic. The Corona Diaries Project, open source audio stories from around the world where people load up a minute from their cell phones. As we look at the protests for racial justice around the world, we see a further explosion of co-creative participatory practices. I'm going to end with just 3. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram feeds for decentralized live stream on-the-spot organizing. The Illuminator Project, which uses mobile projection to have the BLM letters projected on buildings at protests. And finally, my favorite because it's low tech, the chalking of sidewalks in communities around the world with protest against racial injustice and protests against the killing of Mr. George Floyd. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman. That was indeed very enlightening, and I'm sure it'll raise many questions, particularly with the different dimensions of co-creation that you highlighted. And interestingly, that's what we also try and emphasize in our classroom within the independent media courses. And I'm now going to invite our next speaker, Brenda Longfellow, who is a professor of cinema and media studies at York University.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. I'm at a cottage just north of Kingston. So I'm very happy to be here today. What I think I'm going to do is just talk about, of the 50 speculations that we published in Afterimage, there's one that really spoke to me, and that was number 6, which is co-creation is not fixed or defined. It is a process that is contextual and contingent on a wide spectrum of variables. In my own piece, I talked about how co-creation is inherently messy and dependent on the fact that one has to be constantly moving and open to unpredictable revisions. And of course, COVID has thrown us a huge, messy challenge. So I want to just talk about my own work right now as a case study and thinking about co-creation. So for the past 2 years, I've been involved in a project co-creating a video installation with a group of formerly incarcerated women in Vancouver. And for 2 years, we've worked with elders, we've organized a circle, and we shared stories. And after about a year of doing that, we began to just brainstorm what a media project might be. And we came up with an idea of doing a video installation. So before COVID, we were working with a theater designer to start to design this. We'd also received a grant that was going to extend this collaboration to women who were incarcerated in the Fraser Valley Institution in Vancouver. And we'd been spending a lot of time developing relationships with the assistant warden, with the elders who worked in the prison. And we were just on the cusp of locking our schedule. We had, our places booked, an Airbnb, when COVID hit. And of course, everything was put on hold. So we've really had to learn how to pivot in this moment. And I'll just talk about the various vectors of this project and how we pivoted as a result of it. And I think it is one of the responsibilities in co-creation is maintaining relationships. And it's very difficult to retain relationships over Zoom, I have to say. So with the video installation, what we decided to do, because I did not want to wait for another year to actually have closure with the women that I've been working with, we pivoted to an online version. So, and this was a challenge. It was a conceptual challenge. We had shot everybody with vertical 4K, and it was supposed to be 6 4K monitors. We had to make a big conceptual leap to rethink that for the web, but that's in process with an animator and a web designer, and we're quite excited about it. It's now become a project about responsive listening. The other project that I have put a link to in the chat section is called Lockdown. And this is one of the many projects, very similar to some of the work that Patty was talking about. There was a challenge put out by a very well-known producer programmer in Canada to make a film in 2 weeks with no budget. And I decided this is a wonderful challenge. I love this. And it gave me an excuse to get back in contact with some of the women who I'd been in touch with. And, I felt so anguished that we weren't able to go to Vancouver, and all the emotional work that we'd done and the intensity of those relationships was really in jeopardy. So we did this film called Lockdown, which you can see, it's on the web. And the idea of it was to weave the Zoom conversation with these 6 women who provide advice about how to survive lockdown during COVID. The other part of the project is now put on hold, working with women. We don't know when prisons are going to be opening. This was a much broader, more developed project, and we're really just waiting to see what will happen with that. But what I will say, and just is that it's been so extraordinary to watch, in some ways, how history is co-creating with us. Our project is a project about abolition. We were always very inspired by writers like Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who talks about abolition as a practice of denaturalizing the criminal justice system. And I don't think 2 years ago when we started this project that we would imagine that thousands of people around the world would be in the street calling for the defunding of police. We've also been just astonished by the work that's happened by abolitionists and activists in pointing attention to the harms that are happening to people in prison because of COVID. And the end of Lockdown, our little short film, we talk about the numbers that have been affected by COVID in Canadian prisons. Of course, that number is huge in America. There's the Marshall Project talks about 46,000 incarcerated people have tested positive for COVID in the US, and 570 people have died already. But one of the pushes, and I think this is part of a larger co-creation, is that we've begun to hear these calls for decarceration, and thousands of people have been let out of prisons and the sky didn't fall. So it feels like we're moving into a very different era, and we're just really excited about the possibilities of what's been happening and joining that on the ground when we can. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Reece Auguiste. Mr. Auguiste is a documentary filmmaker and a scholar whose research focuses on the African diaspora, transnational screen cultures, and archival studies. Over to you, Reece.
Yes, thank you, Raza. So I'm going to be looking at co-creation in documentary practice, but in more broader terms. So the current discussion pertaining to co-creation or to co-creative practice in media arts, and by extension other fields, is predicated upon an interventionist strategy to shift what has become a dominant way of knowing and doing to push against an ideological stance that has since the mid-20th century structured and determined how media arts production is produced, is to proceed, meaning that creative practice can only be achieved through the lens of a single authorship, sometimes referred to as an auteur practice. The descriptive labels are of little importance to me. What is of greatest significance, and in my view carries greater epistemic weight, is the fact that this idea is rooted in the ideological precepts of individualism and clothed in the armor of 19th century romanticism. And that is the modality of practice that has dominated, in my view, the pedagogy and our supposed way of knowing and doing. I'm pushing against this idea because its precepts are not aligned with the concrete reality of production practices and does not in any way articulate the historical and contemporary experiences of those who have worked collaboratively. Neither does it take into account a growing trend of artists, journalists, and other professionals who seek each other out in the belief that collaborative practice can result in deeper and more meaningful ways of working, a way of being that is less emotionally and psychologically corrosive and certainly less extractive. Therefore, this panel has collectively proposed to, I would say, like recalibrate the terrain of media arts practice through the lens of co-creation in the broader context of 21st century demands. And because demands are always contextual, always fluid, always in the process of becoming, then co-creation itself is also contextual, dynamic, and not fixed. It is not an ideology of creative practice, but rather it is somewhat predicated upon a contextually driven social, political, and cultural processes. This elasticity that is at its core allows for collaborators to define it for themselves, to rewrite its precepts contingent upon the demands of the project at hand, or for that matter, the historical moment or social and cultural situation. This mode of practice requires two things, at least in my view. One is a fundamental, what I refer to as a kind of ontological shift, and two, an epistemological shift in relation to knowing and doing. An ontological shift pertains to a radical reconstitution of the self. That is, one moves from being for oneself, which is the crux of sole authorship, to being for others. It is through the lens of being for others that a new ethics can emerge. These are not somewhat mutually exclusive processes because they are integral to the formation of a new ethos in which co-creation is no longer a proposition, but rather an actuality. But for this actuality to take root, there has to be in play what the French philosopher Badiou calls the event. And what do I mean by the event, or rather what does Badiou mean by the event? As a point of quotation here, he says that an event is something that brings to light a possibility that was invisible or even unthinkable. An event is not the creation of a reality, it is the creation of a possibility. It opens up a possibility. It indicates to us that a possibility exists that has been ignored. The event is in a certain way merely a proposition. It proposes something to us. Everything will depend on the way in which the possibility proposed by the event is grasped, so elaborated, incorporated, and set out in the world. The event that we all are dealing with, I believe, is multifarious, and it is constituted by three interconnected processes. One is the global economic crisis. The other is the coronavirus pandemic. And number three is the upsurge of social protest nationally and globally. The latter two, I believe, are key determinants in the emergence of co-creation as a possibility, but a possibility that I believe can quickly become an actuality on a broader scale than it has sort of previously been. This event has opened up a space for a radical rethinking of practice. And this rethinking must occur within the framework of what collaborative practices might look like within a pandemic. I believe there's going to be a series of structural shifts politically, socially, and culturally. And those structural shifts will bring with them new demands with regard to how we create work. I'm not saying that co-creation will replace the corrosive hegemonic model of practice, but rather co-creators now have an opportunity to bring collaborative practices nearer to the center. So therefore, the central question here, I believe, is this: how do we organize to create work, be it artistic or purely political, in a way that is commensurate to or can meet the demands of this unfolding event, which is economic, pandemic, and social and racial justice? And the reason why I'm framing this argument in this way is because I believe that at the center of creating work, is an ontological question, but there's also an epistemological question. And I believe that those two things have to come together in a very kind of like a fusion of those two things in order for us to begin to rethink what a collaborative practice might look like in the context of this event that we're going through right now. And I'll stop right here.
Thank you very much, Reece. And our next speaker is Helen De Michelle, and who is a media artist and writer from the San Francisco Bay Area. The detailed bio, if I may remind everyone, can be seen in the chat section. And also I would request all the participants to please start preparing your questions. If you have your questions, please write them in the Q&A section so that we can start moving there after our speakers are finished. Helen, over to you.
Thank you, Raza. I would like to start by speaking from the point of view of my experience as a filmmaker and someone who thinks about how to communicate this work to a younger generation. First of all, I'd like to say for me, co-creation is a liberation, a way of seeing and acting before, during, and after a project. For me, it is a practice that opens up new ways of relating to everybody involved in a production before, during, and after, and constantly being open to inquiry and interrogating the standard methods that we've all been using when it comes to making a product. So it also is something I'd like to open up to everybody, is how to learn and build skillful means to uncover and work with the hidden powers and emotional dynamics that can complicate a documentary project. We recognize that in any kind of a documentary, because we're working with a fluid and dynamic situation continuously, is that we must recognize a sense of fear, a sense of uncertainty, and acknowledge that there are always going to be windows and walls that are coming up. Therefore, I want to bring up a personal story and then conclude with a kind of process designed to bring this into a how-to. So about 5 years ago, I was doing a workshop with a co-creative project, and a young journalist said to me, well, how did this project impact you? And I had nothing really to say. I was silent. I never thought about how the project impacted me personally. I knew how to talk about how it impacted people. I knew what the impact campaign would be. I knew how it was distributing, but me, myself, I couldn't really give her an answer. So I used that particular question for a long time to think about really how do we as filmmakers think about what we do ourselves personally. So I had participated, as I wrote about, in the documentary, it was called Mental Health and the Documentary Business, that the D-Word Forum put on last year. And what was very interesting is that filmmakers from around the world in a closed space were able to actually discuss their feelings of personal isolation, of despair, of fear, and no emotional support. And so it ended up, though, from starting with a predicament into how do we change the inequalities of a system that is no longer sustainable. So I again started to think about how do we work differently in this moment of pandemic and protest? How can we rethink and experiment and work beyond systemic disparities? So I would offer right now the concept of process design. And that is really, for me, one of the moments of ways of seeing that liberate at the heart of co-creation. It's kind of a scaffolding that we can encounter assumptions and move forward. So I'd like to offer to you one particular kind of process design that I felt was really meaningful and continues to be for me, which is active voices, prenups for partners. Because we talk about collaboration, we want to do it, but we don't always know exactly how to begin a process of dialogue and conversation. So for example, in that process that is on the website, there are several different depths of prompts. And you will find that there are questions like, why are we working together? How will we work together? Who pays for what and when? And what happens when things in the world or things between us in our relationships are subject to change, just like Brenda talked about before. So I'd like to leave you with this idea of ways of seeing is a practice. It's a personal practice. It's very small. It can be among people, and I think can be actually intimately worked through within the interfaces that we have right now during the pandemic. And that it's always a work in progress. Co-creation is never completed. It's always a work in progress, never perfect. This is not about perfection. And I hope that I'll be able to elaborate on some of these themes as we continue the discussion.
Wonderful. That was really insightful. And our last speaker is Dorit Naaman, who is a film theorist and a documentary filmmaker from Jerusalem, teaching at the Queen's University in Canada. Before I ask Dorit to start, I would remind all the participants that please write your questions in the Q&A box, and because after this speaker, we shall move on to the Q&A session. So over to you, Dorit.
Thank you, Raza, and hello, everyone. I'm speaking from Kingston, Ontario, which is situated on Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee lands. And I'm actually, as a settler, on a journey to learn how to co-create with the land itself, which is, I think, what we all need to do if we want to have a future, an environmental future. But that's a bit of a side note. I'd like to share two thoughts today. One is about co-creation at the time of COVID, and the other one is about co-creation at the time of social unrest. So many people around me, students and colleagues, are lamenting the inability to do field work or filming or creative practice at this time. And it is indeed very difficult not to be in the field. How do we build relationships in the way that Brenda was talking about if we cannot actually sit together with people and have a face-to-face conversation? So I'd like to take this moment to actually step back and think a little bit about our reliance on a location or a few locations, and more specifically, a romantic idea that a community is coherent, is contained, and maybe we idealize that a little bit. Working across distance has some advantages, I would argue. So the Quipu project, for instance, is a good example. It was set to audio document the experience of Indigenous women and a few men who were forced sterilized in the 1990s in Peru. And it was out-facing. It wanted to call for reparations, for social justice, for accountability. But it had a perhaps unintended result. The women who were from all over Peru, who gave testimonies, could also call a landline and hear other women's testimonies. And for some of them, for the first time ever, they realized they were part of a much larger community. They were not alone, and they had nothing to be ashamed of. And in fact, a kind of a coalition of women emerged out of that process. So the lack of focus on one community and the open structure that relied on technology, in this case, actually enabled the creation of a new community. In my own experience producing Jerusalem, we're here, and the link is in the chat. I worked with Palestinian families who were a diaspora from Jerusalem from the 1948 war, and were all dispersed. I couldn't get to a particular community through any community organization, through elders. There was no formal process or hierarchical process. It was lateral work, getting the word out, finding people literally all over the world. And what I found is that the fact that we didn't have a physical community had a few effects. First of all, it created a virtual hub that was unanticipated. It actually created a communal space through the project and the process of working on the project, and people met each other. But more, it also allowed for a lot more voices because you're working laterally and not hierarchically. It allowed for individual engagement and diversity rather than the official approval that the gateway keeper. And it allowed for new communities to emerge that were unanticipated. I'm going to move and talk for a minute about co-creation at a time of social protest. And periods of social unrest often pit disenfranchised groups against each other. And what is the role of co-creation, or the capacity of co-creation to work in these very intense entanglements? So here is a short example. With two other colleagues, I'm embarking on a participatory research creation project in a local park. And the park is sitting on a toxic landfill that covered a wetland that connected to an island that had indigenous presence on it for over a millennia, and has some Huron-Wendat remains. And due to COVID-19, the city of Kingston allowed homeless people to camp at the entrance to the park. And because I'm involved in our mutual aid society in Kingston, I've also been involved with the plight of the homeless people, petitioning the city, and also have created relationship with campers. The camp presence caused some distress among a grassroots group of indigenous and allied caretakers of the island. And they're really worried that there will be fires and other damage to a sacred place. So if I had ethics clearance, which we don't yet have, would I have been able to work with both groups? So a single author, going back to both Reece and Patty's talk, a single author of a linear documentary project would have thrived on this kind of conflict. It feeds and builds a drama. And you can read our critiques of single author projects in our 50 speculations, which are part of the dossier. But we're not interested in fueling this kind of conflictual drama. And neither do we see our role to be mediators of communication between the two parties. We're not coming from above. Is there a way for us to do co-creation with both of these groups that might be at conflict with each other? And can we do this work ethically? And I think the jury is still out on this question. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for your remarks. And we can now move on to the Q&A session. I will remind everyone who has joined us from many parts of the world and the US and Canada to please post their questions in the Q&A box. I will start with the first question, if I hope I'm saying this name correctly, by Isigul Yaren Kose, who asks, I wonder about the framing of being for the other, and what would it mean to reframe it as being with the other? Or are these instances of being for and being with during the process of co-creation? So I would perhaps request one of the panelists to respond. Maybe Dr. Zimmerman, would you like to start?
Sure.
Yes.
That's a really great question. And I think when we're talking about co-creation, we're talking about multiple iterations of being with others. I think there is no one way. I think that these emerge in documentary practices out of these very particular moments. And I think in the world of co-creation thinking, the term others often is sometimes reconceptualized. So here I think I'll throw it over to Reece.
Yeah, so this notion of being for oneself and being for others is not really grounded in just the being for others. It's also grounded in being with others in the sense of how do we create work collaboratively where where at the center of that creative practice is a dialogue. And it is through the dialogue, a critical dialogue around the work, about the situation, that this idea of being for others actually comes into play, right? Whereas in the sole authorship model, it's somewhat more extractive. The notion of dialogue is not at the center of the discussion. It's more a question of delegating. Okay, you do this, you do that, you do this, do that. Like what I'm interested in is entering into a dialogue with my co-creators in trying to solve a problem, because be it filmmaking or multimedia arts production essentially is about, I think, like problem solving. How do we solve problems in order to, to achieve something? And I think that very same idea also operates within the kind of political sphere of social protest or political protest. Like, how do you organize in a collective way that is non-extractive?
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists would like to add to what has been said already? Or shall we move on? Okay, please, Helen.
Yes, I like a new version of what the word confusion could mean. Connect and fusion. This is a way to, at this moment especially, how can people involved in a project merge together and fuse different kinds of ideas through what tool we have, which is the tool of dialogue and communication. And in all of our experiences, what we found is when we shift slightly from the idea of a product that has to be made for a specific audience or goal and open it up to a process of power sharing throughout the entire arc and beyond, all of a sudden the idea of con and fusion become very, very rich and able to take us in new ways that we hadn't determined before, imaginatively. And I know that both speakers from Canada definitely have found that in their long-term projects.
Great. Thank you, Helen. Oh, yes, but please go on, Brenda.
Oh, it seems to me this is a kind of really core ethical question as well. And while I do think it's easy to demonize single author documentary filmmaking, there's a lot of ethical documentary filmmakers who spend a long time in community. But I think the distinction with co-creation is the way in which, not that every decision is elaborated collectively, but that there's a feeling and understanding what representation is all about. And I think people in the digital era are much more conscious of both their ability to become an agent within the field of representation, as well as what are the implications of these kinds of representations. So with co-creation, it's much more iterative. It can be painful. You know, in our project, I felt one of the most compelling of our subjects at a certain point, after having seen, you know, a version of the project and was very excited about it, 2 days after screening, decided to pull out of it. And that's painful for everybody else and painful for the project, but it's part of the project. It is, you know, as Helen and others were talking about, it's long-term negotiations, and it's producing something for a community, but it's also outward facing with a consciousness of what the implications of those representations are.
Thank you. Thank you. And we can move on to our next question, which is from Jolene Dyer, who says, I have worked on collaborative documentary and photography projects in post-conflict Northern Ireland. Whilst the COVID-19 context feels entirely new and unfamiliar, there does seem to be factors that are similar, particularly in relation to conflict contexts. Could I ask the panelists what they think the role of collaborative documentary might be in the post-COVID context, particularly for those who have been bereaved or have experienced trauma? So maybe we can start. Dorit, would you like to start, and then we can go on to the others?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think when COVID hit us, I definitely went into my war memories, and even though my brain knows that most of my adult life I've been part of the stronger party in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I also as a child suffered the trauma of that, and but I think it took me a little bit of work to separate COVID from war. And while you go into this survival instinct, and while I think that people who have experienced all sorts of trauma are often handling COVID maybe better than people who haven't, I'm not sure they're all related. What I do find that is really important to the survival of all of us at times of conflict and at the pandemic time is relying on each other. And I think that a lot of people talk about the strength of their communities, whether they're now on Zoom or whether they're in locally. And I think a lot of people are realizing that we do need each other, that we can't actually survive alone. And that has really strengthened the social fabric. And that is certainly my experience of growing up in Israel, was of a much tighter social fabric than in North America. And I still miss that. And I think that that can definitely lend if we keep that, if we take that kind of the spirit of that commitment to each other, that ability to listen and recognize needs, the long-term relationship, the deep time that goes into building relationships, and translate it into all our practices, whether it's research or creation or any other kind of work, we will be better off.
Would any of the other panelists like to add something to this? Okay. Yes, please, Brenda.
Oh, I just wanted to say that, you know, in agreeing with Dorit, that one of the principles of co-creation, and I think this is one of the speculations, is that it's a slow process. Mm-hmm. And slow processes are ones that allow the support and understanding of how trauma impacts people. So this is a very different model of building relationships, of deep listening, of being trauma informed. And that's not just conflict situations, but it's situations, you know, for example, with incarcerated women, many of whom come out of violent backgrounds. And of course, prison itself is entirely traumatizing. And it really requires, and I think this is the wonderful advantage of co-creation, or thinking in this different kind of conceptual frame about becoming trauma informed, is a slow process. And it's a process where you can never have too many facilitators in a room, and you can never go slow enough, actually.
Thank you. We have another question by Jolene, but I will come to that later because we have a long list now. So this is a comment come question from Joseph Steele. And it says, I'd like to hear more about the risks of co-creation that come from structures in the university. What I'm curious about specifically is that large grants to the departments like those in CMS, where Open Doc Lab is situated, and the one or two places who are also one or two PLS, I don't know what it means, who are often white and often white men. The departments skim these large grants to the tune of 50%. The rest is spent on the project. Why not make BIPOC, refugees, emigres, etc., the authors or co-authors? Certainly, there are other kinds of reciprocities. The informants, collaborators in the films might need to be part of allocating how funding is spent. Now, this is a long and provocative question, so I don't know who wants to address it first. From the university perspective, I suppose, as well as giving due voice to the co-creationists. Dr. Zimmerman, would you like to start and maybe?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for a very provocative question. I'm not sure I know what all those acronyms are. I might just pull back a little bit to talk and put out there some framing of the political economies of co-creation. And one way to think about it is there isn't one model and there isn't one economy. You know, we're looking at a range of works that can be very highly funded in countries that are still funding the arts and doing interdisciplinary humanities funding. Some projects at American universities that have STEM money, those are highly funded projects, but we can go down and we can look at equally incredible projects that are made with bubblegum and toothpicks. You know, I think we need to think about all kinds of political economies of making work. And, you know, my examples are concrete ones that we can look at the high-end tech values of the global COVID-19 tracker done by 20 expat tech people who are originally from Wuhan. And we can look at very elaborate data visualization that they are able to do because they actually work at these big tech companies. And then we can go down to citizen actions that require nothing besides in Italy or in Ithaca, New York, banging your pan every Thursday night at 6, or having your chalk and chalking the ground, or in the case of Corona Diaries, the German project, all you need is your phone, you record for a minute and tell your story. So I think we need to think of multiple kinds of political economies. And in universities, I think many universities are besotted and kind of overly in love with high-tech, high production values. And I think we need to think about a more heterogeneous range of forms and a heterogeneous range of economies. And I think I will pop the question over to my colleagues on the panel because they are all producers. And I think they have probably more to say about this.
Dorit, please.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm in Canada and I'm not in a situation where anyone is taking 50% off or anything from the university from research funding. But I think that the question of how money is spent and who gets those decisions is, as Brenda talked about, and also Helen, are important questions, right? And so that's one thing that has to be discussed in co-creative practices. I think that we have a lot of work to do to educate funders because these processes are slow. They require trust. They don't end with the release of the project. When I'm touring with Jerusalem, we're here, I'm not doing distribution. I'm actually, it's still part of the production in a sense because stories come up. that are as emotional and as significant in those events, and are emotionally demanding and require relationships and responses that take time. So there is, most funding agencies have a time limit, and they want to see results, and they push you to actually release results even before you're finished, whatever that means in co-creative practices. And so we have a lot of education to do about funding structures. The other thing that we have to do is make sure our funding structures, whether it's tiny little grants or big grants, are flexible in title changes, because things in co-creative practices, things change a lot as you do the work. And having the possibility to add somebody as an associate producer because they have put in a lot of work, or changing titles and in working laterally, and having that possibility is really important, and not all funding structures allow that.
Thank you very much. We have now many questions, and okay, Reece, you can add a bit.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something very quickly to Dorit's point, which is that the funding agencies themselves need to rethink their funding policies in relation to creative practice, because the model of funding itself is based on the extractive model, right? And they do not understand that co-creation requires a longer period of development, of reflection, of process, of getting to know the community. That takes a long time. And therefore, I think that in order for co-creative practices or for co-creation to be better funded, the funders themselves need to kind of change their funding policies to be more aligned with the kind of co-creative objectives that we're talking about.
Right. Our next question is from Benjamin Ogrodnik, who is addressed that question to both Dr. Zimmerman and Reece Auguiste. You both have elaborated on co-creation as manifesting non-hierarchical forms of creativity, but how might critics, philosophers, and historians begin to analyze media from a co-creative critical framework? From your perspective, what are the levels of media materiality, authorship, production, exhibition, distribution, etc., that would be centrally important in such an analysis? Finally, can you share any noteworthy examples of co-creative analysis which can buttress the co-creative aesthetic practices which proliferate in our society? Oops. So it's addressed to both Dr. Zimmerman and Reece. Maybe you can just very quickly address that, because our list of questions is growing longer.
Pat, you want to go?
Yeah, I'll go and just I have a very simple question, a simple answer, which is I believe co-creation, as well as the long legacies of community-based media, are underanalyzed in both the field of academic screen studies and documentary studies internationally, and also by critics and by magazines and by journals. I think journals and magazines and almost all film festivals default to an auteur model of high art cinema, and that these community-based participatory models and models of media practice and journalistic and documentary practice that migrate across platforms, for example, in new media interfaces, which every single one of these panelists have done, are often seen as kind of hard for film festivals to program, right? It's easier to download the video link and roll it in the theater than it is to figure out a VR salon, or to figure out a more interactive salon to show offshore, which Brenda has done, or Helen's Lunch Love Community, or Dorit's Jerusalem, We Are Here. So what I would say is we need to get more people writing and thinking about this, because I truly believe the pandemic and the protests require us to reset and rethink everything we thought about media, and to really enter this new terrain with the courage that what we know is that we do not know everything, and we need to actually make more space for this work. I think if we're programmers like I am in my other life, we need to show this work and we need to program it. I think if we are professors teaching at universities, we need to be disciplined and expand the works we show students beyond the international high art models. I'll pop it to Reece.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I just want to add to this by saying that the academy, universities and colleges have been historically invested in a particular model of practice. And the pedagogy in those institutions tend to reflect that interest and promotes that interest. So one of the reasons why there aren't volumes and volumes of analysis on co-creative practices is because those institutions are graduating students who have been taught one particular model. And they go out and they write about the auteur, about single authorship. And they tend to ignore the fact of the reality that there is a very substantial body of artists who are working in collaborative ways. But they do not have the language or the philosophical understanding to really appreciate that kind of work. So as a result, it is marginalized. So from my point of view, so the professors have to make a greater effort to introduce students to the history of collaborative practice, its historical significance, and its cultural contribution to our social world, and actually train young academics to actually be able to address in a very critical way that body of work. Because from my perspective, that body of work has been historically like marginalized, right? Both in terms of graduating students who want to create work and those who want to write about the work.
Thank you. Yes, Helen.
Yes, and to the questioner, to begin the process by beginning with the makers across the arc of a project, to research, to interview, to talk to them about the impact that the project may have had in the community and to themselves, and investigate how a project is part of a larger continuum in a social environment, so that the media piece is not privileged at the center, but becomes part of a larger mosaic and a web of relationships that are above and beyond simply critiquing whether something works or is successful.
Thank you. So Sergey has this question. Would it be possible for speakers to share a recent project that has had the most impact on you personally? Now, some of the speakers have already mentioned their projects, but we should maybe ask our distinguished panelists to go over. Maybe Brenda, you spoke about your work in Vancouver. Maybe if you want to add quickly, and then we can move on to Helen and Reece and Dorit.
I think I'll pass. I mean, I've talked about, I've put links up to the work. There's so much, you know, the Kipu project that Dorit mentioned is just an extraordinary project. And I'm actually working with the web designer who came on in the final stages of that project. And I think that, you know, we've talked about co-creation in terms of working with subjects and the levels of trust and ethical responsibility in that relationship. But co-creation, especially when you're doing work on the web or interactive work or installation, also involves collaborations and co-creative enterprises with creative technologists, designers, etc. Offshore was a large interactive project that we did that came out a couple of years ago about the Deepwater Horizon disaster, but really it was about making us think about this world of petroleum extraction that is always beyond our vision. And I was also working with the web designer I'm working with now, Mike Robbins from Helios. And we eventually made him a co-director because his input into the design was so phenomenal. And it wasn't simply us producing content that then this envelope of interactivity housed, but the interactivity and the web design were a core part of the project itself. So I think it's important to think about co-creation at multiple different kinds of levels.
Right. Helen, would you like to add something to that from your own experience? And may I request to keep it really brief because of the time?
Yeah, I would say to point people to the actual film called Crip Camp and their amazing impact presentation as a series of short webinars throughout the summer where people with disabilities are coming together to really talk about their experiences. And one quote that I think really encapsulates co-creation is that inspiration that begins in youth, which happens in this film, most likely, leads to radical, world-changing results over the course of one's life and period and time. And I hope that these comments are resonating with young people who are watching this.
Thank you. Dorit, would you like to add?
Sure. I would mention two projects that are inspiring to me. Agi Ebrahimi Bazaz, who may still be here, has a recent project called How to Tell an Immigrant Story, which is combines VR, reenactment, and documentary, working with immigrants and seasonal workers and people with precarious immigration status in the US, and working really creatively about how to bring the stories out without compromising the safety of people. So I think that's a good example. And another project that is very different, but I don't know if anyone here has been on the Corona Haikus Facebook group, which also is now a web page and really brought people from all over the world to share what they're seeing in 3 simple pictures and a few lines, and has created this incredible community. Yeah, so I'll stop here.
Thank you. Reece, would you like to?
Yeah, I was thinking of Alison Lebo's like Filming Revolution, which was a kind of curated piece with filmmakers and artists and journalists and others in Egypt around the Arab Spring. I thought that was a really kind of very innovative and forward-looking project. And it's almost like a model or paradigm of a kind of co-creative endeavor. Another would be Jonah Comfort's the Stewart Hall project, and then the final sort of conversation, which is about Stewart Hall, the cultural theorist. But I know Jonah Comfort's work very well. He's a very good friend of mine. And I know that when he works on this kind of multimedia projects, he's really pursuing a kind of collaborative kind of practice.
Thank you. Dr. Zimmerman?
First, I want to give a shout out Cassandra Godenzi from IDOCS, who is involved in the Corona Diary Haiku project, is actually with us right now. So I want to just give a shout out to the people at IDOCS. Many of you have joined us from Europe and the UK. For me, I like to also give another mention to Engage Media, which is a massive portal for social activism in Southeast Asia. I find the work they're doing during the pandemic and during the protests to be a model of using micro, lowly resourced media to get information to people that will keep them alive and give them information.
Thank you. May I remind all the participants that in the chat area, all the works by the speakers and also links to Afterimage's special issue on co-creation have been posted by my colleagues. So please do refer to them, and you can save them as well for later reading and reference. So I'm moving on to the next question. By Christopher Bolton, which says, what does co-creation look like in an off-campus student production context? For instance, how might community-based service learning documentary classes, whether done locally or abroad, avoid extractive pitfalls. So this is again requires a lot of time, but anyway, we'll who wants to start? Helen, do you want to?
Well, maybe we can also tag team with Brenda in talking about the concept of a talking circle and how children can really engage in, again, many of the questions that come up in the active voice prenuptials is how do they express their spontaneity in an environment that builds trust and relationships among each other to bring up issues in ways that they had never perhaps thought of before, and then turn it into a creative expression that then begins to become a kind of documentary project eventually. Does that make sense, Brenda? A talking circle?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the talking circle, you know, comes from indigenous traditions, and it's a long, ancient modality of cultural transmission, storytelling, healing, et cetera, et cetera. And we, you know, the first project that we're working on is called The Circle, which embodies those kind of principles. But it's really about patience and listening. So there's a talking piece that is handed around, and it's not people, you know, in our Western culture, we talk on top of each other. And of course, the academic institution is built with this kind of competitive discourse. But in the talking circle, you have to wait. You have to listen, and only when it's your turn do you formulate something. So I think it's a wonderful model that's been adopted by all sorts of social groups and the restorative justice movement. And it's, I mean, it's really generative in terms of building relations. So it's one model of how one might work in community. There are many different models of how to work in community.
Okay, any other responses, or shall I move on to the next one? Okay, so this is by Leshu. I'm struggling with my question, but I'm thinking about what's happening with statues right now as a powerful moment of co-creation, whether in spray painting and transforming them, or even in the playful addition of statues rolled into the river to be so relocated on Google Maps. What I have been thinking about is how these moments of coming together to reframe and engage with history and the present. And I've been wondering how these can or will be chronicled in ways that are equally vibrant and ongoing. Okay, so I think this is a provocative question once again. And I don't know who wants to take this. Brenda, do you want to start and then?
Thank you, Leslie. That's a beautiful question. I love it. Of course, all of this is being documented on the internet right now. I mean, we're talking, co-creation has, you know, it's improvisational, but it's also a process where there is a lot of things that are happening. And I think for me, I'm just seeing, you know, Black Lives Matter and this kind of spontaneity about an international movement where similar kinds of actions are happening. And it's not just marches and demonstrations, but it's about a reconceptualization of what physical space is and about the long legacy of colonialism. So I think, you know, just to add to this, it does feel like we're at a threshold moment, and there is no going back with some of this. And I just hope we can keep this momentum up post-COVID, that we've opened up this conversation around decolonization, anti-Black racism, the reclaiming of public spaces, the rethinking of the criminal justice system. And this is happening with bodies in the street in remarkable ways. So in many ways, it's a really incredible time. It's also a dangerous time, obviously.
Indeed. Dorit.
Yeah, I wanted to say that my first thought and feeling in the past few weeks is that what has erupted now, and I don't know why it erupted now and not, you know, over the years, because there's nothing new about the murder of George Floyd. But what has erupted now and in local places is a result of long co-creative processes of activist groups, of anarchist groups, of lobbying and petitioning cities to change names, universities to change names of buildings, of requests to change signage around statues or remove them, and a lot of debate. So it's not coming out of a vacuum, and that it becomes visible at this moment in such a spectacular way that lends itself to media documentation. We shouldn't forget that there was a lot of discussion in rooms and gardens and online between people who put a lot of work to articulate what is wrong and what kind of aggression and violence these passing by these statues is for people of color.
Right, great. I'm moving on to the next question, Iranti.org. It says, is co-creation merely masking the power dynamics, almost misleading to the most vulnerable to believe that they have buy-in? I struggle with this idea, although I think it's innovative.
Can I jump in very quickly?
Yes, please.
I think our first, in our 50 speculations, the first one is that co-creation is a utopian ideal. That is something to aspire to, that it is very hard to realize, and that it should never mask the power relations that exist. And that is exactly where we came from, was with both critiques of the single author model, but also critiques of romanticizing the idea of co-creation. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. And I would say also that the whole excitement of the practice of this utopian enlightenment model is the idea of slowly dissipating what could be power relations, which will then maybe close down again, but it's a continuous opening, opening, and opening, and never resolving, with paradoxes nested within paradoxes. So in asking that question, you may want a nice and tidy answer, and we're all here to tell you there is no nice and tidy answer. It is a practice.
Right.
Yeah, I just want to add that it's also a very messy practice, because it requires one to leave one's ego at the door, and very few people are capable of doing that, and that we are not kind of as naive as to think that there are no power dynamics within co-creative structures. There certainly are, but I believe that if one can engage in meaningful dialogue and critical dialogue, some of these power dynamics can be mitigated against, you know? It's when you do not have a dialogue, or you do not come to the table and leave your ego at the door. And like I pointed out in my presentation, you know, it's not about being for oneself only, but it's about being for others or being with others. That is where I think some of the corrosive impact of these power dynamics can actually be slowly kind of so deconstructed.
Right. Right. Dr. Zimmerman, you wanted to add something?
No, let's move to the next question.
Right, right. Thank you. David Staton, I'm curious if there is the very possibility that the digital divide will inhibit or prevent certain voices and certain stories from being co-created and shared. We have unfortunately discovered this in remote teaching. Very interesting question. So maybe Dr. Zimmerman, you would like to give it a shot?
It's a good question. And I think that whenever we're talking about technology, we are always talking about power, we're talking about access, and we're talking about centralization of softwares and interfaces. These are all parts of large transnational corporate entities. That's a given. So I think we have to always interrogate this and ask, all technologies, all ways in which we use them are contradictory. And so we need to always think about, are there ways we can liberate them? Are there ways we can use them and redeploy them? We're here on Zoom, and to quote my wonderful, beloved colleague Louis Messiah from Scribe Video. He said, who would think of interface and technology invented for Fortune 500 companies to move product and information around the globe would be taken over as an alternative broadcasting system from the likes of all of us? So I think we have to constantly be in a constant state of reset, reimagine, rethink. I did not know how to work Zoom 3 months ago. And here we are on this high-end professional webinar system. So I think that we always have to take it as a given that digital divides exist, and we have to have as our foundational core set of political values, how do we liberate this technology? How do we democratize it? How do we embrace amateurism in all of its forms as an emancipatory potential to change the world? I'll leave it at that.
Right, thank you. We still have many questions and sadly just 5 minutes left, but I'm going to pick and choose and be completely arbitrary. So Anne Sieco from University of Massachusetts Amherst, this is for Karen, and she says, thank you so much for your brilliant work with Afterimage. And I was wondering if the idea of co-creation is relevant for institutional transition and archival histories in the case of journal like Afterimage. Specifically, how has the Afterimage in its latest iteration and institutional home dealt with the challenges of representing, documenting the full composite histories of the journal and visual studies workshop, etc.? How has the earlier digital content of the Afterimage during the period with visual studies workshop, the latter with significant additional content not included in print, has been archived and reconstructed? So maybe Karen, this is for you.
Okay. We are navigating that with within the very different toolbox of an academic press. So 45 years in print, and the first 26, I think, of them, there were no digital traces. So the University of California Press is digitizing, slowly working backwards. And once we have that, there are a lot of possibilities for distribution and dissemination and further co-creation, kind of tagging on to what Helen and others were saying about the creation doesn't end when the product is finished. The product doesn't end. So I think that conversation can kind of feed back to, and we can interrogate those old issues, literally issues and things we discussed in the earlier days. And I've lost the thread of these several layers of that question, if you want to reiterate anything.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I think you've broadly addressed that, because the idea was how have the visual histories and the archives, how's the transition been in your own iteration? So I guess I can move on to another question by Zila Eisenstein, who asks the panelists, how can co-creation find ways to express the silenced trauma of sexual and domestic violence in COVID, along with the silences of children's abuse, which is a known heightened pandemic, and or the silence of structural exploitation of misogyny? Any one of you can address this. I don't know, Dorit, would you like to?
Yeah, I don't have an answer. I mean, I think that I often think that with trauma, the drive has to come from inside. It has to come from people who want to bring things out and have a way or a relationship in a community, not from the outside. I also have to say that I don't think that co-creation is always appropriate. It's not always desirable. It sometimes can actually replicate power dynamics or mask power dynamics that are at place. And sometimes what we need to do is collect a lot of evidence about what's happening and anonymize it and make it available in a way that will make it very safe. And you can't do that by creating a collective where everyone is exposed, because it exposes individuals to danger. So I think that we need to make that visible and legible, because this is a very intense and real problem. But I'm not sure what the correct or ethically right, proper way to do it is.
All right. So this is going to be the last question, because it's a specific one. It's a question for Brenda, by Ariella Palke. And it says, I'm interested in the relationship between co-creation, authorship, credits, and payment. Interested in your decision-making process with regard to lockdown, where you are listed as director and the women in it are listed with first names only and credited as featuring. How are the viewers made aware that the project is co-created with the participants?
Thanks,
Very brief.
Thanks, Ariella. That was their decision, just to use their first names. They wanted some level of anonymity. Some of them are still on parole and under surveillance, so that was their decision. This is just one iteration of multiple projects that we're doing. The other projects have much more iterative and interactive components and working with community. This was something that was very down and dirty. So not a perfect model of co-creation, but one where the co-creation was built on the relationships that we'd already established and the conversations that we had on Zoom.
Thank you, Brenda. And with this, our Q&A session unfortunately has to end. We have a few questions left, and we'll make sure we note them down and perhaps do some follow-ups. But many of these questions are comments, and some of them are praising for your brilliant presentations. Now, I'll request all the participants to just take about 50 seconds precisely with their major takeaway from today and from their experience from the Afterimage issue as well. So maybe we can start with Dr. Zimmerman.
Sure. First of all, I want to thank Park Center for Independent Media and Afterimage for sponsoring this really generative discussion. What I have to say is that is very simple. The global pandemic and global protest are in and of themselves horizontal, decentralized movements that are now paired, intertwined, and entangled. And they have created a total reset of everything we thought about media. I see this as a collapse of the world as we used to know it, and it requires a reset and a reimagining. So my words are, why co-creation, why now, and how? And now is the time. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect. May I request Helen with your takeaway?
Well, my takeaway continues to be, in this moment of confusion and contradiction and grief and sadness, still, I maintain that we're in a world right now of windows against the walls, windows that open up in the walls, and that, if anything for me has come out of this discussion, is that everything we're doing as creators and artists and facilitators is rooted in our own local context. And that for me, the most satisfying part of all of this is how to break down isolation, open up community, and be super collaborative in a messy way and super local.
Thank you.
Keep asking the questions.
Thank you. Reece?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. First of all, thank you for hosting this event, and I would also like to thank all those who've joined us on this webinar. Clearly, there is interest in co-creation or in co-creative practices. My takeaway is that I believe that we are in a moment where there is a possibility to inscribe co-creative practices in numerous fields, not only with the media arts, but also the political, the social, and so on and so forth. I believe this is the beginning of a very important dialogue moving forward. And my hope is that co-creative practices will move closer to the center both within the institution of the academies, rather, as well as within the broader space of cultural practices.
Right. Dorit?
Yes, thank you for organizing it. And thank you for this conversation that we have been having for a few years, alongside conversations with other people, Liz Miller, Judith Aston, who is here, Mandy Rose, there are other. So I think that the thing about co-creation, I'm going back to the last question that Brenda was asked, why are you listed as the director and they're featured? Co-creation is not necessarily co-authorship. It may be co-authorship, but it may be other relations. The question for me, and this is what comes out of all these conversations, is how are those relationships negotiated? And are they negotiated with trust, with good faith, with knowing that when conflicts arise, and they always arise in the process of production anyways, how are they going to be resolved? And going back to something Reece said, with checking up our own, checking in on our ego, always being checked as well, being willing to be checked. And
Wonderful.
That's my takeaway.
Wonderful. Brenda?
Okay, very briefly, again, thanks to everybody. Thanks to all the participants. This feels like a form of co-creation too, and I always come away from these feeling quite renewed. So thank you for that. My only takeaway would be, I think what the pandemic has done is opened up so many possibilities. I'm very concerned about how this momentum is going to maintain itself post-COVID. So I hope we can all maintain that momentum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not the least, Karen, would you like to add your takeaway?
Well, I would just like to thank the panelists who are the dossier contributors and the Park Center, and especially Raza. And in the spirit of this conversation and the framing of it, I invite scholars and makers alike. We have room for everyone to participate in what is inevitably in every issue, the co-creation of the journal by contributing. And I've posted links to everything you need to know in the chat. And this is our first time doing such an interactive online thing, but it certainly won't be the last. And I thank you for being here and hope you tune in again.
Thank you so much on behalf of the Center and Ithaca College. I thank Afterimage and all the most brilliant panelists. I mean, I've learned a lot personally, but also I think following up on many remarks on how things, the pandemic and the protests, I mean, the way they are changing our perception of the world, certainly it has implications, not just for the documentary or other forms of media, but journalism itself. And I think we are seeing all that transition taking place as we live through this moment. And with this, I would thank all our participants as well from different parts of the world, from Latin America, Asia, Canada, US, and many other places. And we hope to continue this series. And until then, goodbye.